So I'm Lisa Cahill from the theology department here, and I'd like to welcome you back today. It's great to see everyone on this beautiful day. I would also, of course, like especially to welcome our speakers. We have, first of all, Professor Rick Gallardi from our theology department at BC. The second speaker will be Bishop Robert McElroy from San Diego, and finally, Father Antonio Spadaro from Civiltà Cattolica, who will give us an Italian perspective. So with that, I will sit down. I do have the fatal and annoying 2-minute cards. So at 13 minutes, I will put one of those there, not accusing you, of course, of planning to run over. Okay, good. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. Our conference has been reflecting on the significance of Amoris Laetitia for the work of moral formation and pastoral practice. This particular session invites reflections on questions of ecclesial process. If we attend to the ecclesial processes associated with Amoris Laetitia, our attention can move in two directions. First, toward the ecclesial processes and presuppositions that gave rise to this remarkable document. And second, toward the present ecclesial moment in which the document is being received. Considering the first, we can note the remarkable preparation and conduct of the two synodal assemblies, the unprecedented processes for consulting the faithful, the inclusion of the testimony of married couples, the remarkable papal encouragement to parrhesia, candid speech. When we consider the ecclesial reception of the document, the first thing to note is the papal encouragement of Amoris Laetitia's regional implementation. And let's be clear about what's going on here. What the Pope has been encouraging is nothing less than an ecclesial application of the principle of subsidiarity, the very application that had been forcefully rejected but a few decades earlier. We must also acknowledge the open debate surrounding the reception of the document. That debate has certainly included wide-ranging appreciations, like those that have dominated our own conversation. But there have also been instances of harsh criticism, including the publication of dubia and filial corrections, even as these instruments have relied on historically and pastorally decontextualized renderings of doctrinal propositions. Indeed, a striking feature of our contemporary situation is that few expect there to be any ecclesiastical censure for either the authors of the dubia or the signatories of the most recent filial correction. Our church is currently being led by a pastor who is remarkably undisturbed by accusation. But this forbearance is not just a papal personality trait. In my view, Francis has not responded to these attacks because he does not accept the presupposition that authority works exclusively along a vertical axis. The very language of filial correction, emphasizing a parent-child exercise of authority, presumes that ordinarily authority is exercised in an exclusively descending direction. Only in the most extraordinary of circumstances, for example, papal heresy, is the movement on that axis reversed. Francis, by contrast, imagines a more pluriform and multi-directional exercise of authority, in which genuine authority, or more accurately, authorities, contribute to the whole church as its members learn to listen to others, including those with whom they disagree. If we draw back our gaze from focused consideration on the preparation for and reception of Amoris Laetitia, we can see a larger ecclesial project being enacted. In the fall of 2015, while the synod was still in progress, Pope Francis gave a speech commemorating the 50th anniversary of the creation of the Synod of Bishops. It may be the most ecclesiologically significant address of his pontificate to date. It was in that speech that he explored the ecclesial principle of synodality. He noted, as we all are aware, that the word synod comes from the Greek synodos, which could be loosely rendered traveling on a journey together. This principle, he admitted, quote, is an easy concept to put into words, but not so easy to put into practice, unquote. The synodality of the church, as he imagines it, combines two central themes of his pontificate, both of which have been amply discussed here: accompaniment and listening. We see, of course, his commitment to accompaniment in his evocative image of the church as field hospital, a church in which its ministers must have the smell of the sheep on them. But consider also what he doesn't say. Strikingly absent in his papal addresses is any sacral rhetoric regarding the priesthood and ministry. Rather, one hears a consistent call to the church's ministers at every level of ecclesial life to go out and meet people, attentive to their brokenness and particular concerns and insights. In that speech on synodality, he called for a thorough reimagination of the church and its ministries. And I quote, "In this church, as in an inverted pyramid, the top is located beneath the base. Consequently, those who exercise authority are called ministers, because in the original meaning of the word, they are the least of all. It is in serving the people of God that each bishop becomes, for that portion of the flock entrusted to him, Vicarius Christi, the vicar of that Jesus who at the Last Supper bent down to wash the feet of the apostles." And in a similar perspective, the successor of Peter is nothing else if not the Servus Servorum Dei. As an aside, his choice here to associate the Christological character of presbyteral and episcopal ministry with Jesus washing of feet, rather than its more typical association with the institution of the Eucharist, is suggestive of a quite different trajectory for theological reflection on ordained ministry. But that would be an entirely different talk. The second theme embedded in the Pope's understanding of ecclesial synodality is that of listening. Now, appeals to ecclesial listening may seem rather unremarkable. After all, I've never met a leader who didn't think that he or she was a good listener. Yet, according to Clemens Sedmak, Francis has made listening a central epistemic practice in the church. And by this he means, I think, that the Pope is inviting the church to see attentive listening as a patient and painstaking exercise in theological discovery, a privileged process by which we access the truth God wishes to share with us. Francis has, on several occasions, called for the concrete implementation of ecclesiastical structures and consultative mechanisms at every level of church life, and these are to be welcomed. In Evangelii Gaudium, he wrote, quote, "The bishop will have to encourage and develop the means of participation proposed in the Code of Canon Law and other forms of pastoral dialogue out of a desire to listen to everyone and not simply to those who would tell him what he would like to hear," unquote. What is most welcome in this text is not the call for consultative structures. Rather, it is the recognition that the fruit of consultation must not be sanitized. Authentic ecclesial consultation entails more than gathering together safe voices into an ecclesiastical echo chamber. I suspect that most bishops and pastors, and for that matter, most provincials, university presidents, deans, department chairs, and corporate CEOs all think they're consultative, mostly because they seek out the opinions of others. Yet the Pope rightly insists that authentic ecclesial consultation within a truly synodal church A consultation that aspires to be more than a pragmatic public relations maneuver must attend to a wide range of voices, including those who bring harsh criticism and disagreement. Amoris Laetitia, as we have seen, is both the fruit of that kind of listening and an invitation for that listening to continue as we seek to implement its vision. In his recent book, Prophetic Obedience, Bradford Hinze contends that there is a conflictual or agonistic dimension of Christian life that has been too little acknowledged in ecclesiology. An overly romantic ecclesiology, and this is one of the real dangers attendant on certain forms of communion ecclesiology. An overly romantic ecclesiology privileges ecclesial harmony to such an extent that conflict and complaint are occluded from theological reflection. Yet Hinze argues that the discernment of the sensus fidelium, for example, must be widened to include the laments, conflicts, and disappointments of God's people. In Evangelii Gaudium, we find in a passage exploring the dynamics of a healthy society echoes of what Francis expects from a synodal church. He writes, "Here, our model is not the sphere, which is no greater than its parts, where every point is equidistant from the center, and there are no differences between them. Instead, it is the polyhedron, which reflects the convergence of all its parts, each of which preserves its distinctiveness. Pastoral and political activity alike seek to gather in this polyhedron the best of each. There is a place for the poor and their culture, their aspirations, and their potential. Even people who can be considered dubious on account of their errors have something to offer which must not be overlooked." Unquote. During a recent visit to Australia, I was on a panel with Archbishop Mark Coleridge of Brisbane. The Archbishop outlined a bold plan recently approved by the Australian bishops to hold a plenary council for the entire Church of Australia in 2020. It would be only the 5th such plenary council in that church's history, and the first in almost 80 years. When, as a participant on the panel, I was asked to comment on the plan for a plenary council, I noted that the proposal held both tremendous promise and considerable risk. If the council were conducted in keeping with Francis' spirit of synodality, it could be a truly transformative ecclesial event. Such a council would provide a space for patient listening. This listening would be attuned to the wisdom of God's people, but it would also give space and time for lament and even protest, however messy. It might well include a ritual expression of repentance for the failings of church leadership in the midst of that country's horrific clerical sexual abuse scandal. Such a council might do much to reverse the tide of public opinion in Australia and bolster morale within the Australian Catholic Church. However, if it is conducted as an ecclesiastical showpiece in which its leaders are determined to move on from the past and stay positive, then it might well set back that church for decades. By way of conclusion, let me simply say that in its determination both to accompany people in the messiness of their lives and to listen to people's insights, laments, and concerns, Amoris Laetitia is not just the fruit of 2 synodal assemblies. It is an apt reflection of and for a synodal church. For this remarkable document invites us to see the wisdom of listening before speaking, learning before teaching, praying before pronouncing. For only out of the deep humility of a truly synodal church can the good news of Jesus Christ reverberate with clarity and power before a world hungry for a word of hope and an offer of salvation. Thank you.
A lot of time, so congratulations. And the next one we would like to invite up would be Bishop McElroy from San Diego. So please.
The issuance of Amoris Laetitia provided us in the Diocese of San Diego with an opportunity to examine whether a pattern of regular diocesan synods on specific topics could constitute an effective, collaborative, and faith-filled avenue for sustainable pastoral reflection and planning. The apostolic exhortation addressed a pivotal facet of the life of the gospel in the contemporary world. Its topic represented an issue area in which lay insights have particular depth and authority. And the results of a synodal process could reach into all levels of the local church precisely because marriage and family life suffuse both the human experience and the ecclesial experience in every dimension. For these reasons, in early 2016, the pastoral leadership of the diocese began to investigate the idea of holding a diocesan synod to promote the reception and application of Pope Francis' forthcoming exhortation to the Church on marriage and family life. There were several obstacles to undertaking such a pathway. The first was ascertaining whether it was possible in church law to have a diocesan issue on a synod on a specific issue. After hearing from a variety of my canonist friends a rather uniform response of, well, I've never heard of this, but I don't know of any law that precludes it, our planning team concluded that that was permission enough, and we moved forward. The second obstacle surfaced in the initial consultations with the Presbyteral Council and the lay leadership in the diocese. They were, in general, open to and even intrigued by such a project, but they pointed to one central imperative. The synod must result in conclusions which could be implemented, and there had to be sustained follow-through. Several of the senior priests and lay leaders recall that the last diocesan synod 2 decades ago had not witnessed substantive implementation, leaving everyone deflated and leaving the word synod with a bad name in our diocese. The third obstacle was the most daunting. The priestly and lay leadership pointed out if this kind of a recurring synodal process was to be a pathway of consultation and implementation that was ongoing, it was essential that the process be contoured in advance to a timeline of no more than 2 years in total for the planning, the work of the preparatory committees, the holding of the synod itself, and substantial implementation. Thus, at every step in the design process, it was essential to have a fairly strict timeline, a requirement which at times demanded sacrificing some elements of breadth and depth in consultation and inclusion. Father John Hurley, the former staff director for evangelization at the Bishops' Conference, agreed to plot out and oversee our process. The subject matter for the synod was drawn from Amoris Laetitia and focused on 5 issue areas: witnessing to the beauty and the richness of the Catholic vision of marriage, forging a culture of invitation within our parishes to young couples, nurturing children, spirituality and family life, and ministry to those who have been divorced. The 142 delegates included the Presbyteral Council, 1 lay delegate from each of the 99 parishes of the diocese, 4 deacons and 5 women religious, as well as representatives from the young adult communities in our colleges and universities. The parish representatives were appointed by the pastors, and happily their median age was only 41, which is very low for this type of gathering, but we asked them to do that. The delegates manifestly represented the great ethnic and cultural diversity of our local church. In the months before the synod, delegates were assigned to their choice of 5 working committees, one for each of those topics that I mentioned. In addition, we assigned a different theologian to work with each of the working groups. Each of the parish representatives held a listening session in their parish on the specific topic of their working group, and the results were collated and distributed to every member of that working committee. The synod itself was a weekend gathering devoted to prayer and reflection upon the specific pastoral proposals developed by the working groups in order to refine them, dialogue about them, and then adopt those which seemed most pressing and attainable. The overarching theme of the gathering spoke to the emphasis on prayer, reflection, and unity. Quote, "We recognize this very active gathering in the name and grace of our God is a profound declaration of ecclesial identity, hope, and witness," unquote. There was, in fact, a wonderful sense of hope and witness throughout the gathering, and 15 proposals with very specific follow-up emerged for pastoral action. Even in the moments of debate over the direction of specific proposals, there was a palpable sense of God's guiding presence with us and through us. For me as a bishop, both the beauty of the weekend experience and the quality of the proposals which emerged were very powerful. But for the purposes of this gathering, 4 aspects of the synod process I think are particularly illuminating. First, there was a burning and pervasive desire to provide an intensely welcoming stance to young couples as they approach the church on questions of marriage and family life. Overwhelmingly, the delegates believed that the church is in a moment of profound crisis in its relationship with the millennial generation, and that this necessitates an unwavering stance and strategy of outreach and welcome. They said, "We must take young couples where they are and walk with them toward marriage, but not balk or nag them when their progress is too slow." The delegates also shared horror stories from young adults they knew, often their children, adult children, or sometimes they themselves, as they had approached the church on the question of marriage and met with hoop after hoop to jump through, and so many no's before they'd get a yes. Number 2, the working groups and synod gathering itself displayed a continual commitment to the enculturation of applying the teachings of Amoris and the church to the concrete realities of the church in San Diego. One long discussion of the working group on nurturing children illustrates this focus. The committee was discussing the need to reach out in a special way to support single-parent families. As they talked, they came to the conclusion that this outreach must look different in San Diego because of our particular social reality. For most of the United States, they said, single-parent families are those where death or divorce has severed a marriage or where there was no marriage to begin with. In San Diego, the committee said it includes these 3 realities, but also includes 2 other groups, the deployed and the deported. San Diego's immense military population and the number of families broken by our national immigration policy mean that the outreach to single families must look and operate in a different manner because of the type of local church we are. The process of applying church teaching in Amoris based on the specific realities of a particular diocese suffused at crucial points the work of this synod. And I think it constitutes one of the central benefits of a synodal process. It's not just an application of a document in the abstract, but the application in terms of the specific lived reality of our local church. 3, as the process of the synod unfolded, the focus on family spirituality grew more intense. There was a great perception and fear that families, especially young families, do not have a spiritual dimension to their marriages or their relationship with their children. They cannot teach their children affectively about God because their marriages have no place for prayer and spiritual realities. It's not there. The synod ultimately concluded that the diocesan outreach program for marriage and family life should be entitled the Office of Family Life and Spirituality to point to the need to place spirituality at the heart of every step of implementing Amoris in the Synod. They really felt strongly about that. They felt there's a vacuum there, and we need to bring spirituality there. Fourth, the discussions on the questions posed in Chapter 8 took on a trajectory which our planning committee had not foreseen. There was very broad support for widening the pathway to Eucharist for the divorced and remarried. In fact, more than 4/5 of the delegates sought a teaching even broader than Amoris, and they felt that this question and the lack of a more broad solution raises substantial issues about the compassion of the Church toward the divorced and remarried. But beyond this, the longest and most profound discussion of Chapter 8 touched upon the core doctrine of conscience. When the delegates encountered the richness of our Catholic approach to conscience formation and decision-making during the theological presentations of this chapter, they protested that they had never heard this before. And they felt as though a critical part of their faith had not been communicated to them, with the result that their moral decision-making and peace of mind had been hobbled throughout their lives. It must be emphasized that the delegates' enthusiasm for the rich tradition of conscience didn't spring from any perception that conscience is a get-out-of-jail-free card, but from a conviction that the Catholic doctrine on conscience takes seriously the daunting dilemmas, the mixed motivations, the paralyzing personal issues, and the doubts which characterize adult moral life. The delegates made one of the most emphatic conclusions: the need for a wide-ranging program of education about conscience and moral decision-making at all levels. After the Synod concluded, it was essential to move quickly toward implementation. The planning team caucused and identified 23 names of delegates who should be approached to serve on a 15-month implementation committee. All 23 agreed to serve. Not a single one said no. They adopted a two-pronged strategy at the implementation committee. First, redesigning the entire process of marriage preparation to follow a more catechumenal model, and using pilot parishes to create models for integrating the principles of Amoris into the diocese. 12 pilot parishes stepped forward to radically recast their approach to marriage ministry by applying the 15 mandates of the Synod in their ecclesial life. Each parish formed a marriage and family leadership team of volunteer couples and single parishioners who committed themselves to the implementation effort so that the pastor and the parish staff would not be overly burdened. Like many elements of the Synod, implementation in the pilot parishes took on a much different pathway than we had anticipated. Because these parishes that we have vary dramatically in their makeup, the initiatives which they adopted in furtherance of the Synod principles were extremely diverse. I kept looking for what is in common that we can bring to all the parishes. Then I realized that's not the point. It's not the commonality. It's the particularity and the application. Parishes with immigrant parishes emphasized base group initiatives for married couples. That was their model of integrating it. Anglo parishes with large numbers of young couples focused on supportive structures for nurturing community, enduring crises, and beginning spiritual growth within the family. We have many parishes with relatively few young couples. They've created strategies focused on long-term marriages, the stress of age in marriage, and the need to celebrate the success of married life in very concrete ways in the life of the parish. Each of these pilots is the story of a parish attempting strenuously to embrace the synodal proposals, but the pathways of implementation have been wildly different. One vital element of the integration of the synodal process into the life of the Church took place last week during our annual priest week-long convocation. The week was dedicated to the principles of Amoris, and Lou Camelli spoke about the formational identity of the document and the role of conscience. Our new Marriage and Family Life Office staff presented the catechumenal model of marriage preparation, and I dialogued with the priests about Chapter 8, the internal form, and LBGT issues. There was significant enthusiasm and openness and some reservations. Overall, the widespread sense among the priests that we are in a state of crisis regarding marriage and young adults generated substantial support for moving forward. How successful was the synodal process in San Diego? It produced focused, prayerful, broadly based reflections on the central issues presented by Amoris in our local church. It called forth a series of creative new initiatives which are realistic and capable of being implemented. It was a moment of revelation which brought through lay experience and witness a greater recognition of the specific ways in which the church itself creates obstacles for young couples seeking marriages, for the divorced, single parents in distress, and members of the LGBTQ communities. It was short enough and limited enough in its aspirations, so it did not produce exhaustion. At the same time, this synodal model has definite limitations. A topical synod cannot explore the wide linkages among ecclesial issues that a general synod can. The short timeline for designing the synod did not allow the depth of parish-based consultation which would have enriched the process and engaged more members of the diocese in it. The consensus-based approach tended to underplay the significant divergences among delegates, and thus San Diego Catholics, about neuralgic issues. In summary, the process of a topical synod is a powerful tool for expansive pastoral planning in a diocese on one specific segment of ecclesial life. It teaches bishops about how laymen and women wrestle with the issues that we write and speak and teach about. I was a learner there. And the most fascinating thing to me was how they thought through these various problems, because it was different in some areas that I would have thought. And it is a moment for the palpable presence of God to touch a local church. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, Father Spadaro, I'm realizing, where's Jim?
Yeah.
There,
Hi.
there you are, right in front. Okay. We actually have a little extra time
That's
because
fine.
we only have
We'll go
3
to coffee.
speakers. We'll go to, okay.
We'll go to coffee. We'll have
So
a long
please
coffee
come up.
break so that we can have-
I will let you know when you have 2 minutes
Absolutely,
left.
don't worry
Okay.
about that.
I'm just trying to
Yes.
get a sense of the house.
Yes. Okay,
Good
great.
morning.
Please.
Good morning. I'm very honored to be here with you. And so I am Italian. Actually, I'm Sicilian. And you'll see soon why this matters. And don't be scared, don't worry. So many outsiders, especially Northern European and North American observers, enviously assesses the Italian approach to personal morality as far more casual than that to which they are accustomed. It is an attitude of lascia fare, let it be, or as the French would say, laissez faire. There is some truth in this, but it is not the whole story. There is another deeply embedded current of moral rigorism, which is also a part of the culture which Alfonso Maria de Liguori, St. Alphonsus Liguori, addressed in his moral tractates. And elements of that rigorism remain. A great blessing of Amoris Laetitia is that it steers a course, a path, and gives a moral direction that is neither laxist nor rigorist. Its moral tone is evangelical realism. Amoris Laetitia is perfectly tuned with what we read in the Catechismo degli Adulti, Catechism for the Adults, by the Italian Bishops' Conference published in 1995, where we read, tending to the fullness of the Christian life does not mean doing what is more perfect in an abstract sense, but doing what is concretely possible, end of quote. The key to understanding that evangelical realism in the context of moral choices is discernment. This is the key word of the document Amoris Laetitia. I want now to explore in some detail the process of discernment that Amoris Laetitia opens up considering the Italian context and approach. Discernment refers directly to the conscience and to the historicity. The Italian way of thinking, the Italian philosophy since Giovanni Battista Vico, Neapolitan like Liguori, for example, is grounded on history. Vico inaugurated the modern field of the philosophy of history. For Vico, by looking at particular facts of history, at historical evidence, it is possible to understand better the truth and even to make metaphysical claims. This is basically the Italian way of thinking. And of course, now it's clear to know why the message of Pope Francis will resonate in our souls and minds. Pope Francis often repeats that one danger that must be avoided, and a danger to which in fact one often succumbs, is being abstract, theoretical, idealistic. He writes, this excessive idealization, especially when we have failed to inspire trust in God's grace, has not helped to make marriage more desirable and attractive, but quite the opposite. End of the quote. So it's important to insist on a positive and welcoming pastoral approach capable of helping couples to grow in appreciation of the demands of the gospel. Growth implies time, which means history. With regard to wounded situations, I still remember the sounds of the words saying by Francis when I interviewed him in 2013, when he talked for the first time about the church as a field hospital. That really deeply struck me because he was very profound, was very slow in saying that. So meditating. So these words came from his heart, his deep vision. So with regard to the wounded situations and to those that are called irregular, the exhortation takes over from the relatio finalis of the Ordinary Synod, the complex criterion that St. John Paul II formulated in Familiaris Consortio, the careful discernment of situations. So we must conclude that the Pope realizes that one can no longer speak of an abstract category of persons, enclosing the praxis of integration in a rule that is absolutely general and valid in every instance. Since the degree of responsibility is not equal in all cases, the consequences or effects of a rule need not necessarily always be the same. So Pope Francis affirms that it can no longer simply be said that all those in any irregular situation are living in a state of mortal sin and are deprived of sanctifying grace. End of quote. It's not just a matter of ignorance of the rule. In an objective situation of sin, which may not be subjectively culpable or not fully such, a person can be living in God's grace, can love and also grow in the life of grace and charity while receiving the Church's help to this end. This is why discernment is so crucial. It's a constant process of opening oneself to the Word of God so that it can shed light on the concrete reality of every life. So the Synod had declared that priests have the duty to accompany the divorced and remarried in helping them to understand their situation according to the teaching of the Church and the guidelines of the bishops. So the bishops of the different churches in the world are given guidelines. The Italian Church, like all the churches of the world, has noted reasons for enthusiasm, but also resistance, made more or less explicit. Considering Italy, the clearest explication of the perspective of Amoris Laetitia comes from the Regional Bishop Conference of Sicily. a wonderful document. It starts saying, of course it's in Italian, but the Church of Sicily received with joy the pastoral address of Pope Francis expressed in the Apostolic Exhortation Amoris Laetitia, in which are opened new perspectives for the pastoral action toward family and the affective life, and so on. This document of June the 4th, 2017, pastoral guidelines were expressed that articulate 3 stages according of the chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia: accompanying, discerning, integrating. Discernment is central here in this document of the Sicilian bishops. We read, "The formulations of Amoris Laetitia open cautiously to an eventuality of access to the sacraments that is situated only in the theologic place of discernment." This is beautiful for me. This is the center of this document. It's not a canonical norm, but the potential of a path, fruit of discernment and personal and pastoral maturation, exists. The potential of a path exists. The effort of integration has its fulcrum in the practice of discernment. It is distinguished into pastoral and personal. So now I'm going to read 3 short passages of the document in translation, of course. The first one, pastoral discernment. Pastoral discernment indicates, the Sicilian bishops said, indicates the task of pastors, first of all bishops and priests, when confronting people or situations that are the object of pastoral action. It aims to grasp the particularity of the differences and of the various situations, taking into consideration the set of circumstances, subjective and objective, putting them into relationship with the teaching of the Church and of the bishop, showing the faithful the path of faithfulness and growth of Christian life in the situation considered. End of quote. So this is the first level, pastoral discernment. Second level, personal discernment. Personal discernment indicates instead specifically the discernment exercised in the first person of the faithful when faced with the need to take a decision in order to act in a particular situation. To live as a Christian is supposed that whoever acts seeks to be faithful to the will of the Lord, which is manifested in the situation itself. This is very important. In the situation itself. Moreover, it is why the faithful turns to the pastor. On discernment, the third passage I'm going to read, on discernment, the document clearly states, is it the principal task of priests to accompany people involved on the path of discernment, according to the teaching of the Church and the guidelines of the bishop. Discernment, according to the Sicilian bishops, allows pastors to evaluate case by case, especially in regards to the progressive inclusion of people who, finding themselves in a situation by now irreversible, are particularly in need of welcome, accompaniment, and mercy. End of a quote. So the Sicilian document concludes with clarity that in some circumstances, therefore, as regards the divorced and remarried, according to the evaluation of the confessor and taking into account the good of the penitent, it is possible to grant absolution and to admit him or her to the Eucharist, even if the confessor knows that it is an objective disorder for the Church. This is the conclusion of this document. Then it's no longer possible to judge people on the basis of a norm that stands above the head of all and ignores real life. The pastor must involve himself in the life of a person in front of him. And our formation, this is another crucial point, the formation of the priests, of the seminarians, is not always up to this challenge. In Italy, this challenge that involves seminarians, the theology faculty, the formators, is sensed. The priestly formation program ran the risk of educating in the light of overly clear and distinct ideas, and therefore to act within limits and criteria that are rigidly defined a priori, and that set aside concrete situations. And then the seminarians, when they become priests, find themselves in difficulty in accompanying the life of so many people. I had the experience to talk about Amoris Laetitia in some dioceses and to priests, and I realized that those who have more resistances are the young priests, not the old priests, but the young priests. The old priests are very open. What the Sicilian document clearly is aware about is the significant difficulty that Amoris Laetitia poses for some pastors who insist on dealing exclusively with the binary division of state of grace and state of sin, state. Of course, there is a state of grace and a state of sin, because we can be in a loving relationship with God, and that means is indwelling and sanctifying grace. Alternately, we can be in a state of sin or alienation from God. An emphasis on the state of a person for the Sicilian bishop, a state of a family, a state of a marriage, however, situates people by definition in a static position. But we Italians have an historical way of thinking. In these last years, Pope Francis has worked at length to renew the Italian Episcopal Conference, given the high number of pastors who have reached 75 years of age. This year, there was also the turnover of the president of the Episcopal Conference. But all his recent nominations have had a strong, very strong pastoral character. The Vicar of Rome and the Archbishop of Milan are both formators of the clergy, very beloved by their priests, who work for some time along these lines. Also, some cardinal nominations have made still more evident pastorality as a central criteria. Thank you.
Thank you. I did not have to use the mic.